set of last season's Othello, director Andrew Paul has found the key to what defines classic tragedy. This is Andrew's 15th season as founding artistic director of Pittsburgh Irish and Classical Theater. Under his leadership, PICT has produced over 60 main stage productions and completed 2 successful international tours. Andrew, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Kristen.
You open the season with Antony and Cleopatra, and it opens in previews tonight.
Yep.
Tell us how that's going.
Well, it's going great. It was a project. It's a big show, obviously, and it's a play that has sort of a mixed reception among the critics because it can be a little unwieldy. It's got 18 scenes in the 4th act, and it's a little bit cinematic. And Shakespeare was way ahead of his time in that regard. But we wanted to do another project with Jim Christie, who directed the King Lear that we did in 2008. That was really successful. And he comes from the sort of Peter Brook school of directing, and I really like that aesthetic. And the whole idea really came out of the 2 actors who are playing Antony and Cleopatra, because in 2009 I directed a production of Tom Stoppard's Rock and Roll, and Helena Rawati was playing Cleopatra, and Sam Sutsuvas, who's going to play Antony for us, were in that production and said, you know, we'd really like to do Antony and Cleopatra together. And of course I laughed
that's
and
great.
thought, you know, I don't know if we can afford to do that one, guys. You know, it's a huge play. And but then I kept thinking about it because I was really struck by the fact that you know, Shakespeare wrote a play about young love, Romeo and Juliet. And what's really interesting to me about Antony and Cleopatra is it's also a love affair, a doomed love affair, but in this case it's mature lovers. And there's something who are acting like teenagers in many ways, and there's something really theatrical and thrilling about that. And I thought that we should give it a go. So I actually presented it to Jim as an option because we wanted to find another Shakespeare play, and we've been talking about all sorts of obscure plays that he wanted to do. And I said, well, what about this one? And it all sort of came together. So I'm pretty high on it. Hopefully it'll be a crowd-pleasing production. It's a tough play, and Jim's done a fantastic job. I give him the imprimatur of cutting the play down to 2.5 hours.
Oh, that's great.
You know, because modern audiences just can't take 3.5 hours of Shakespeare, and Jim is a very adroit cutter of the text, and he's got it down to 2.5, or maybe even a little less than that, and I think it plays beautifully.
Great.
And yeah, I think it'll do.
How many people are in the cast?
It's pretty big. We got 19 actors in the cast, and in this day and age, it gets harder and harder for theaters anywhere to put on large cast classical shows because there's just not enough audience to recoup the investment. But to me, as a classic theater and with the background and training that I have, for us not to do Shakespeare would be criminal, I think, and. Because so many people are doing it in truncated form and, you know, having 6 actors play all the roles, I kind of eschew that aesthetic, although I can be very effective, particularly with the comedies. But a 6-person Antony and Cleopatra, I think, would just not be
not the same effect.
So I thought we got to go for the whole hog here.
And are you doing it in the same time period?
Well, it's interesting because that's the one thing that'll be a little controversial, I think, about the show, because it's got a very spare set, but it's very mythic. It really is just 2 sort of slate rock walls, one of which has Latin inscriptions in it, representing the sort of Roman half of the play. The other one has Egyptian markings in it, and so it has a sort of mythic stature when you look at the set. But the costuming is very modern.
Great.
And so that's been tricky because, you know, audiences look at the set and they think that, Elizabeth Taylor is going to walk out with the heavy eye makeup and Helena's not, we're not going quite that far with it. You know, it's very much, I mean, the performance is big and it does everything it needs to do. It's a really great performance. But it's we're not aiming to try to get period authenticity with the costuming.
Well, and it sounds like it might bring it a little closer to the audience and what they can understand a little easier, and maybe take away some of that extra.
I always find that, I mean, and Jim and I agreed on this the first day when we talked about working on the production, that we didn't want to have Roman costuming and togas and armor because, one, it's expensive, and 2, I think that it can be done better in film, so why not find a simpler way of telling a story, because we can really focus on, the great actors we have and on the language of the play. And the play has so many great speeches, famous speeches, but it also is a play that is rife with famous phrases that you don't even realize are from this play, or that even that Shakespeare wrote, like when Cleopatra says about her salad days, and there's a lot of stuff like that in the play where the buzzers go off in your head and you think, oh, is that what that line comes from? I never knew that, and then there's audiences will have that moment throughout Antony and Cleopatra, because it is a play that's just packed with wonderful phrases.
Great. Well, you follow it up with something very different, House and Garden.
Yeah.
And one cast performs 2 plays at the same time. Tell us how that's going to work.
Yeah, people have a hard time wrapping their minds around it.
Yes.
Which is one of the great things about it. I just love that, because I'm fond of saying, well, two plays happening simultaneously with one cast, but 2 different audiences, and people just can't. They can't take that in. But it's a brilliant idea. Alan Ayckbourn, who is a genius and always has an incredibly clever gimmick behind almost every play he wrote. And this one has really outdone himself, because he wanted to write something specifically that would be performed at his home theater in Scarborough, the Stephen Joseph Theater, and they have 2 spaces. And he always had the idea of doing 2 plays simultaneously with 2 different audiences watching, but the same cast going back and forth between the 2 spaces. So it's very much a house and a garden. So every time an actor leaves the house set, they exit and they end up in the garden, right? So the audience knows where they're going, because they're actually continuing the play, but in another theater with a different audience. And I think there's something really, really thrilling about that, just when you think about it, my hope is that although house and garden work on their own, each one has a separate main plot. But there's a lot of crossover, obviously, and a lot of subplots that intersect the 2 plays. So my hope is that audiences who come and see one or the other and have a good time are definitely going to want to come back and see the other half of the play, because, even though you can have a full experience just from seeing house or just from seeing garden, you really want to fill in those blanks. Okay, so what happened when he left in the middle of the first act and didn't come back? I want to know what was going on in the garden.
Yeah, I read Garden first, and I didn't really think about the other play too much and just enjoyed it. And then when I read House, so many things were filled in, and there was so much more depth. And while Garden definitely stood on its own, so many subtleties from Garden I got in House. It was really enjoyable.
I think that's true, and although the plays are enjoyable on their own, I think it's the totality of the experience that really makes it kind of great theater.
How do you think the 2 plays speak together?
I think it's interesting, because they're actually stylistically quite different. I mean, if you look at House, it's very much a traditional comedy of manners, and it's in a lot of ways it's very English. But Garden is much more farcical, and it's zany, and it's sexy, and it's sort of crazy, and you have everything from people rolling around in bushes to, rainstorms on stage, which we're going to do, hopefully. And, it's all sort of mass chaos, where House is very much more of a controlled environment. And so I love that the 2 plays have a totally different sort of natural aesthetic to them. So the crossover between the 2 plays is what's really thrilling.
And you have 2 directors for both of the plays. Will you work together?
We will. That was a really tricky thing to figure out, because you could rehearse the 2 plays simultaneously, working on the same scenes that happen simultaneously at the same times, right? And that might be the most cost-effective way to rehearse the play. But the problem is, it's the same characters. So a lot of the table work really needs to be done jointly. And so after really trying to think through this, and I've done a lot of crazy projects where I have to really think through, because we do these festivals with 6 plays going on simultaneously, we agreed, and my associate artistic director, Lisa Grandy, is going to do is basically going to direct Garden, and I'm going to direct House, although there's going to be a lot of crossover, let's face it. The idea is that we'll work jointly almost throughout the process until we get into to tech and then separate running, because obviously we can't sit and watch both plays simultaneously.
Right.
So it's better if one person focuses on one and one person focuses on the other, although I think we will switch so that we can get fresh eyes on them, So it's kind of unique. I mean, I've never done a process quite like that before, so, my hope is that it's all gonna run smoothly, but it's a little bit crazy.
Well, and you have 2 theater spaces, but they're on different floors. So I would love to, be able to just sit and watch the stairway.
Well, it'll be great because that's one of the reasons to do the play there. I mean, the first time when we moved into the University of Pittsburgh at the Stephen Foster Memorial in 2003, and I took a look at the theaters, and I saw how they were connected by a winding stairwell.
Oh, it's winding. Oh, no.
It's so easy because what Aiksborn actually stipulates is you really need to get from one theater to the other, and I believe it was something like 23 seconds was the amount of time that he indicates in his notes for the original production. And he actually had to lengthen that when they did it at the National Theater because the National Theater, if you've ever been there, is like a bunker complex. And the 3 theaters there are separated by this long sort of, it really does feel like a bunker. It's like a long alleyway. And the actors couldn't run it in 23 seconds. They
and
couldn't
compose themselves to then go out.
So he had to add dialogue, but we're not dealing with that. We can do it. I tested it out last summer. I was like, okay, I'm standing in the middle of this theater, and I'm going to take my time, and I'm going to end up in the middle of the other theater, and you can do it in 23 seconds without any trouble.
Oh, that's
I didn't
great.
have to run.
So they'll have time to move and time to get a breath.
I don't know about that, but it's tremendous fun. I love the idea. We've got a really game cast. Again, it's a big cast. I think it's 14 actors. And it's a great ensemble play. I mean, all the roles are good. So you can get 14 great actors who are good farceurs and comedians and throw them together and they're because it's 2 plays. Each of their roles is rich enough. In the way that it's structured that everybody will feel like they're getting their opportunity to shine.
Definitely.